Welcome to Histoire en série en VO, a podcast created by Nicolas Charles and Johan Chanois in collaboration today with Ariane Hudlet. In this podcast, senior and young scholars look at past, present, and future TV shows to analyze the form, content, and impact of your favorite series. Histoire en série en VO, a podcast that connects series to history and humanities. Hello everyone, welcome to the second Histoire en série en VO, in which we will listen to Dennis Tredy. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, welcome.
Dennis Tredy is Associate Professor at Université Sorbonne Nouvelle. He's an eminent specialist of the works of Henry James. He has also extensively written on American TV series, with a particular interest in series from the 1970s, I think. Today, he'll make us look back to a time when we had to be there every week to watch our favorite episode of the series that everyone would talk about the next day by the water cooler, when serious issues would be concealed sometimes in the lightest form of comedy. So this year indeed marks the 50th anniversary of the first season of Norman Lear's breakthrough sitcom All in the Family. All in the Family is an extremely well-known series in the US. Very little in France for French audiences. It was never broadcast on French television. So please, Dennis, tell us what was All in the Family and who was Archie Bunker and why we do need to still talk about it.
Sure. I mean, it's true that All in the Family is still making headlines 50 years later. Just the last month, both Time magazine and Life magazine had dedicated special issues to the series for the 50th anniversary as being one of the most important American television series ever created. I mean, All in the Family is a lot of things, right? Most of all, it's a sitcom that really changed the face of American television, and perhaps for good. It was a huge change. It defined an entire generation of the 1970s, and I think it helped even shape our generation today, though perhaps not exactly in the way that the producer and creator Norman Lear had intended. But I mean, All in the Family was the first in a long series of controversial and groundbreaking television series by showrunner Norman Lear. Norman Lear, who with his fellow producer Bud Yorkin, they had the foresight to buy the rights of a gritty kitchen sink British sitcom called Till Death Us Do Part. And they seemed to recognize that the weekly shouting matches between the Tory right wing, right, the Tory father, and the Labour left-wing son-in-law would not only translate really well into an American working class milieu, but would be the perfect vehicle for a new type of in-your-face American sitcom that would bring the most controversial political issues and social issues of the time right into the American living rooms and into Americans' minds and into their conversations and water cooler, as you said before, right? Water cooler talk, with all of the subtlety of really like being hit in the head with a 2x4, right? It wasn't subtle at all. I mean, just for the setup of the show, the premise, All in the Family was set in Astoria, Queens, at 704 Hauser Street, to be exact, in the modest home of one Archie Bunker. Now, Archie Bunker was an instant archetype for the unbearable, loudmouth, right-wing bigot, right? Racist bigot, who inevitably stumbles over his own malapropisms and his ignorance, and was really played to a T by the actor Carroll O'Connor, who in fact in real life was quite a liberal, and who quickly overcame his initial impersonation of Jackie Gleason. I don't know if you know Jackie Gleason, right, had this very popular TV series in the 50s and 60s. And in the beginning, Carroll O'Connor was kind of impersonating him, if you want. And he very quickly made Archie Bunker his own character that everyone knows and either loves or hates today. Well, in that living room, seated next to Archie in his favorite chair, okay, where no one else had the right to sit in, was his wife, his long-suffering and endearingly innocent, sweet, church-going wife, Edith, played by stage star Gene Stapleton, who won the most Emmys of the four main characters, and they all won lots of Emmys. Also living under the same roof, we have their daughter, Gloria, played by Sally Struthers, a young 20-something feminist in 1971, okay, who was caught between kind of love and respect for her bigoted father and love and respect for her husband, Mike Stivic, played by Rob Reiner, and for her and her husband's really progressive liberal views. Now, Mike Stivic, the son-in-law, the outspoken liberal on the show, is Archie's nemesis, right? He's Archie's weekly sparring partner for incredible, very high decibel arguments on every hot button issue imaginable. And that's what's crazy about the show. All in the Family was thus a vehicle for heated arguments every week. Arguments, okay, over Archie's ignorance, his racism, his anti-Semitism, his sexism, homophobia, and transphobia. But also for heated opinions from both sides on the Vietnam War, on gun control, on student protests. And there were even episodes dedicated to really, really, tough and unusual topics. I mean, topics that were difficult to have on American television at the time, including rape, menopause, sexual assault, miscarriages, and all on a sitcom. That's what's crazy. Sitcoms didn't seem to be designed for something like that, for things that hard-hitting, right? That type of controversial content. And no one had imagined that a sitcom could be so topical and controversial. And so, I mean, All in the Family, as an initial series itself, was a series that ran for 8 seasons and 8 years, right? And 205 episodes. But it had five simultaneous spin-offs that each lasted for many years and covered most of the prime-time lineups of American TV in the 1970s. And it also had 3 sequels, including one, Archie Bunker's Place, that kept the storyline going for an extra 100 episodes after the death of Edith, of the wife, the mother figure. It won countless Emmys, including in its second season, all 4 acting Emmys went to All in the Family, Best Actor, Leading Actor, Supporting Actor, Best Leading Actress, Best Supporting Actress, all 4, which was a first in the history of Emmy Awards, right? It reshaped the television of its time, it reshaped television for generations to come, and it's still controversial and topical today, and I think all of that's not bad at all for a sitcom, right?
Yeah, indeed. When we think of sitcoms from 50 years ago, we don't imagine such controversial issues. Audiences must have been shocked, so much so that the sitcom was preceded by a warning. Here's how the pilot began in January of 1971.
Warning. The program you are about to see is All in the Family. It seeks to throw a humorous spotlight on our frailties, prejudices, and concerns. By making them a source of laughter, we hope to show in a mature fashion just how absurd they are.
From Television City in Hollywood.
Boy, the way Glenn Miller played.
Songs that made the hit parade.
Yes, in that short clip from the first episode, the beginning of the first episode, we really get, I think, kind of 3 insights into the show. I mean, at the end of that clip, we hear the beginning to the famous theme song, right? Those Were the Days, with Archie and Edith singing at the old piano in the living room at the beginning of every episode. The song Those Were the Days, which is really a hymn to kind of conservative nostalgia and what we call today a type of grievance politics, right? Thinking that things were so much better before. I mean, Archie here in this song, he longs for the pre-war and the pre-civil rights America, when, as he says in the song, when girls were girls and men were men, where everybody pulled his weight, when there was no welfare state or social programs. Sound familiar? The second thing that we get from that short clip, I think, is that Norman Lear's goal is really clearly explained in that warning and that disclaimer, that the show is trying to, I quote, to throw a humorous spotlight on our frailties and our prejudices and to show how absurd they are by making them a source of laughter, right? Basically, they wanted to sneak the most controversial topics into American living rooms through what I like to call the Trojan horse of laughter, and basically teach Americans tolerance that way. And the third point, again, from that short clip, something we get is the fact that they needed that disclaimer, or they wanted it. They had the disclaimer because CBS was in a panic about putting on a show like this, right? They feared the FCC, which is the government body that oversees communications for radio and television, right? Okay, they set the rules for that. They were afraid of the government, the Nixon government, okay? They were afraid of angry callers, and that's why they had a whole team of call handlers standing by the phones, or probably sitting by the phone, ready for all of the angry calls to come in that first Saturday that it was on. But in the end, there weren't really many angry calls that came in, and perhaps that was because there weren't many people watching the pilot the first time. The first episode only had 15% of the viewing audience in what we call Nielsen ratings. Nielsen ratings is, the number of people who watch each channel. And at the time, there were only 3 channels, 3 networks, okay? So 15% when there are 3 of you is not very much. They quickly dropped the disclaimer that we heard, the warning that we heard after only 6 episodes, because they started to say, maybe we don't need it, basically, right? But by the end of that first season, okay, the show was number 1 on American television, and it was boosted especially through the summer reruns. In the United States, very often in the summer, is a focus on showing, reruns, showing the same programs from the previous season over, maybe not in the exact order, and it helps boost certain shows, and it certainly worked for All in the Family. But that doesn't mean that people weren't shocked, just because not many calls came in that first night. A lot of people were. Showrunner Norman Lear even got some death threats at one point during the first 2 seasons, when it was really, really, really controversial. And Norman Lear would spend 8 years fighting and dancing around and finding ways to get past the head censor at CBS, at the network, William Tankersley.
Yeah, a lot seemed to get past that censor, though. We're going to listen to a clip of the first argument at the dinner table between Archie and his son-in-law. Can you set this up?
Sure. Well, basically, here at the dinner table, Mike, the liberal, starts by giving a very stirring speech to try to counter Archie's complaints about recent race protests in the United States and the lack of law and order. Sound familiar? Again, which really impresses his wife Gloria, but brings out Archie's vulgar, bigoted anger about assisted minorities in the United States.
Now I'm going to tell you something.
Oh, Michael.
No, wait a second. I'm sorry, Gloria. I know I promised, but I feel I got to say this. You know why we got to break down in law and order in this country, Archie? Because we got poverty, real poverty. And you know why we got that? Because guys like you are unwilling to give the black man, the Mexican American, and all the other minorities their just and rightful hard-earned share of the American dream.
Who said he wasn't smart? That's beautiful, Michael, beautiful.
Oh, that's gorgeous. Now, let me tell you something. If your spicks and your spades want their rightful share of the American dream, let them get out there and hustle for it just like I did.
Yeah, but Archie, you're forgetting one thing. You didn't have to hustle with a black skin.
No, I didn't have to hustle with one arm and one leg neither. So what?
So you're admitting that the black man is handicapped.
Oh, no more than me. He's just as good as me.
Wait, now I suppose you're going to tell me that the black man has had the same opportunity in this country as you?
More. He's had more. I didn't have no million people out there marching and protesting to get me my job.
No, his uncle got it for him.
Yeah, so I mean, that clip, maybe we need to give our own kind of warning here, like they had for that first show. It's true that on this podcast, we're going to be hearing a lot of little clips from the show, and Archie, of course, will be Archie, and Archie will be using a lot of very vulgar expressions and a lot of very disturbing racial slurs. But just, we have to put it in the context, and of course, and the fact that that was one of the reasons why the show was so controversial. I think what we just heard, though, is also a great example of that argument that in that first episode, because we really see a great example of the dynamic that existed between the four characters in that short clip we just heard. I mean, we can see how Archie argues with Mike. We see how Gloria sides with her husband as being so smart. And we even hear Edith. We see how Edith can so innocently make Archie look like a fool, like here when she says, that his uncle got his job for him, right? So he was helped too, right? That type of thing. But I mean, Archie's constant use of those racist and ethnic epithets was really something no one had ever heard of on television before, where censorship was much stronger than it was for cinema. And even today, even on television today, 50 years later, I mean, there are only a handful of slurs like the ones that Archie says, or curse words, that can actually get past the network censors and the FCC. So, I mean, the show framed it basically. Their reason for being able to do it was they told the Oversight Commission that they were framing it as something that was wrong, and they were justifying it, but using it because it was necessary to show Archie's prejudice if they were going to try to help him overcome that prejudice, right? But speaking of censors, that same first episode we just heard a clip from featured the first of a running gag that kept coming throughout the 8 seasons of the show. At one point in the show, it seems innocent enough today, but we hear a toilet flush really loudly upstairs, and Edith yells, "Shut the door, Archie," right? And this was also a sly way to kind of stick it to the censors at the time, because it could even be referred to as the flush heard round the world, because for up until that moment, it was forbidden to refer to a toilet flushing or to bowel movements or to any disgusting bodily functions on television, just as it was in the early versions of the Hays Code for cinema. So Tankersley, the censor at CBS, must have had a heart attack when he heard the toilet flush.
Right, but why would CBS take such a risk, though? They already had so many popular, traditional, and non-controversial sitcoms. They were already the #1 TV network. So why running the risk of angering censors, networks, or audiences?
Well, it was a risk, but the reason for the change that they took and the risk that they took is really an amazing story in itself. I mean, up until then, CBS was the #1 of the 3 networks, with 70% of the most watched shows on TV, and none of them controversial, right? Most of them were harmless fantasy sitcoms that started in the 60s, like Mr. Ed the Talking Horse or The Munsters, and especially towards the end of the 1960s, it was rural sitcoms, The Andy Griffith Show, Gomer Pyle, Beverly Hillbillies, shows about, people from the South of the United States, kind of simple country folk, if you want. And this was because a large majority of TV viewers were, in fact, from rural America, and CBS believed in a simple kind of numbers game, basically. They believed that you needed to have the biggest audience. The bigger the audience, the better to outdo the other 2 networks. But then the Don Drapers of Madison Avenue explained, right, the ad people explained to Paul Klein, the head of research at CBS, something called demographics, right? And the fact that targeting young urban viewers, even if they were fewer in number, would still mean more revenue for their advertisers, okay, and higher prices to sell that advertising than an even greater, vaster number of rural viewers. So Klein convinced the new CBS president, Robert Wood, he just had become president, to do the unthinkable. And we call this the Great Rural Purge of 1970. It's a bit of it sounds really like something earth-shattering, but basically CBS did the unthinkable. They canceled all of their most popular shows while they were still popular, and they replaced them with what they called now relevancy programming. These were urban shows with progressive liberal themes, right? And the first 3 new additions to this new type of programming, okay, all of which would soon be shown the same night on Saturday nights during the same lineup on CBS, included first, one that was focused squarely on feminism, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, which was produced by the star Mary Tyler Moore and her husband Grant Tinker at the time, which is kind of a precursor to Sex and the City. It's about a woman who turns down marriage for a career. It's about her single life and dating life and her life with her female friends. And it would have 3 spin-offs itself to expand its impact on the 70s. There's another one that was really focused on anti-war sentiment, which is, I'm sure everyone knows, and one that cleverly used the Korean War as kind of a stand-in for the Vietnam War to attack this type, to give these anti-war and anti-government attacks. I'm talking, of course, about MASH, which was produced by Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds and ran for 11 years and over 250 episodes. But the other one, was All in the Family. Of those big 3 on Saturday nights, right? It was All in the Family, which dealt with both of those themes, right? Feminism and anti-war sentiment, and just about every other controversial one you could think of, and became the most watched show of the 1970s, right? So it was really, in the end, a bet that paid off for CBS, that big chance and the big chance they took with the rural purge and putting something like this on TV. CBS would stay number 1, thanks to All in the Family and these other shows for the next 7 years, in spite of this huge change. And thanks really to the huge change, thanks to this, what they called serious comedy programs. That was their oxymoron, serious comedy. And all of the network spin-offs and lookalikes that would fill up the lineups of all of primetime for most of the 1970s.
Okay, now, after this context, maybe let's get back to Archie Bunker himself. Archie Bunker has maybe become a household name since then in the US. And let's come back to his trademark bigotry. We're going to listen to a short clip in which he describes what he calls a balanced political ticket. And in doing so, he manages to insult Jews, Italians, the Irish, and anyone who's not a regular American. And of course, you've been warned, he does so in a remarkably foul language.
What's the matter with this? I call this representative government. It's Salvatore, Feldman, O'Reilly, Nelson. It's an Italian, a Jew, an Irishman, and a regular American. What I call a balanced ticket.
Why do you always have to label people by nationality?
Of course, how else are you going to get the right man for the right job? For instance, take Feldman there. He's up for treasurer. Well, that's perfect. All them people know how to handle money. You know what I mean?
No, I don't.
Well, then you got Salvatore running for DA. He can keep an eye on Feldman. You know, I want to tell you something about the Italians. When you do get an honest one, you really got something there.
Oh, Arch.
Well, and here you got O'Reilly, the Mick. You can see that the graft is equally spread around, you know? We got Nelson, the American guy. He's good for TV appearances. Make the rest of them look respectable, you know?
So couldn't the network have been accused of promoting racist and bigoted ideas in this kind of passage?
Yeah, but what we heard, we heard every week on the show, the very racist terms that he used, it's true. Yes, of course, satire only really works if both sides accept that it's satire. There was a recent study done in 2015 for Salon magazine by Christina von Hodenberg, in fact. And what she did was she went back and she analyzed all of the polls from 1971 to 1979 of all of the All in the Family viewers and fans. And she tried to decide, which of them were actual bigots like Archie and which weren't and things like that. And in fact, 20% of the viewers were like Archie and believed every word that Archie says and felt like Archie, 20%. And then on the other end, you have another 20% who believed everything that Mike said, right? And were progressives. And then you had that soft middle, if you want, the 60% in the middle, what von Hodenberg calls the mid-dogmatics, okay? The middle groups who could be slightly swayed and were not that fixed in their ideas, if you want. So the show didn't really create bigots like Archie, but it didn't change bigots like Archie, I guess. And they didn't watch the show for the same reason, if you want. It did, I think, have a didactic influence on that middle, that 60%, okay? And remember that the way the show was organized, Archie is the loudest, strongest voice, of course, right? But everyone else on the show was against him, right? And everyone was trying to get him to change and to be more tolerant. So that shows kind of, the way the show is pushing things, And I think there also might be a little sidebar here, is that I think his popularity among bigots at the time may help explain the success of what was supposed to be a mock presidential campaign in 1972, Archie Bunker for president. Now, when Norman Lear started this, it was a joke. It was the idea of, Archie Bunker for president is ridiculous, right? The whole idea. But people really took to it. Those 20% who really believed what Archie said loved the idea of having Archie Bunker for president and bought up all of the bumper stickers and the things like this, and they really felt that he should be the next president. That was kind of funny the way people took it, didn't take it, took it at face value.
So Archie obviously was the butt of many gags, but did the show make fun of liberals too sometimes?
Oh, yes. I mean, it's true that it made fun of both sides. Though Archie took more perhaps, but it was a balanced ticket, like we heard before, basically, right? This idea that there was a balanced ticket here too. Mike was a liberal, and he was the loudest moral voice of the show, as we even heard in a couple of clips that we heard today so far. But Mike was often mocked as being out of touch, as being a meathead, which was the nickname that Archie very famously gave to him, being a meathead. Dead from the neck up was the idea. And there's a great example of this in the 4th episode of the 2nd season. This is an episode in which the Bunkers find themselves face-to-face with two African-American burglars, played majestically by the actors Cleavon Little, who many of you may know as the Black Sheriff from Mel Brooks' Blazing Saddles movie, and the other burglar is played by Demond Wilson, who will become very famous in another Lear production as Lamont, in Sanford and Son, an all-black sitcom that was also based on a British model, and that would start just a year or two later. Basically, for the scene here, the two burglars are holding Archie and Mike at gunpoint, with Archie's gun, by the way. And the burglars find a way to make fun of both of them very equally.
These guys don't want to socialize with us any more than we want to socialize with them.
What'd you say?
I mean, it's a well-known fact that you colored guys would just as soon stick around with your own kind up there in Harlem or wherever. Is that so? That's what I always heard.
Oh, horse. Look what we done found here. A genuine 100% dyed-in-the-wool bigot. Yeah. Come on, say something big.
Now, wait a minute. Guys, now that's wrong. I ain't no bigot. I'm the first guy to say it ain't your fault that you're a color.
Oh, that's big of a dude, man.
Hold it. Come on, guys. You see, he doesn't understand. He associates the crime and the stealing with the fact that you guys are black and not with the underlying social causes.
Oh, then you must be a liberal. Well, man, we done found us a genuine liberal and an honest-to-God bigot. Now, you can't beat that no kind of way.
Come on, guys. See what I mean? All right, hold it. All right, but put me on now. All I meant was that he doesn't understand what living in the ghetto can do to a man.
And you do.
Well, I'm studying it in my sociology class.
I got to sit down and talk to you. Come on, sit right down here.
Well, I mean, that clip is really great because you really see how at times they made just as much fun of Mike, the liberal who goes to sociology class to find out about the black experience, as they do about the bigoted Archie. And they have a good time making fun of both of them here. And I think that kind of reveals, one of the ways that the show managed to satisfy the FCC, the Government Oversight Agency. Because in fact, the FCC had enforced something that's called the Fairness Doctrine for radio and television. They had been doing this since the beginning of commercial television in the late 40s. And basically, the Fairness Doctrine insisted that if you spoke about any controversial topic, both sides of that controversial topic had to be presented. Not necessarily in equal measure, but you had to talk about both. Both sides of an argument had to be given. Now, the rule was designed to keep news programs honest and balanced, but no one ever thought that a sitcom would even fall under its jurisdiction until All in the Family came along with all of its controversial topics, right? So, but the series still satisfied the FCC's rule with this balance, okay? Even if in the end it left some room for certain viewers perhaps to side with Archie over Mike. Speaking of balance, I should mention another possibly problematic aspect of balance, because if Archie feels racist hatred towards his black neighbors, the Jeffersons, even that is balanced because the show has the black father, George Jefferson, be just as racist as Archie is, but kind of a rabid anti-white racist. And of course, this balance could give some racist viewers, white racists, some cover, right? It could allow them to whine about anti-white racism or say, look, they're just as bad. So.
And did the FCC ever step in, thinking that maybe at some point Archie or Norman Lear had gone too far?
Well, there's a great incident that happened after the 4th episode of the first season, because Richard Nixon, the president, did try to step in, and he tried to sick the FCC on the show to get them to stop. All because of the 4th episode of the first season called Judging Books by Covers, which may have been really one of the most controversial early episodes. It really dealt with homosexuality, head on. Here's the setup of the episode. Mike and Gloria invite their effeminate but straight friend Roger over, but Archie is convinced that Roger is gay, and he doesn't want a quote-unquote fairy in his house, and he goes off on a vulgar homophobic rant, insulting almost, in fact, even all Englishmen as being gay, though he uses a much more vulgar term than that.
You might as well face it. You're all alone in this. We all know Roger, and we all know he's straight. And even if he wasn't, and I said if, what difference would that make? Do you know that in many countries, England, for instance, there is a law that says whatever two consenting adults do in private is their own business?
Listen, this ain't England. We threw England out of here a long time ago. We don't want no more part of England. And for your information, England is a fag country. What? Say, ain't they still picking handkerchiefs out of their sleeve, huh? Are they still standing around leaning on them skinny umbrellas like this here? I know their whole society is based on a kind of a fagdom.
You know you're right, Archie. You're right. The British are a bunch of pansies. Pansies, fairies, and sissies. And the Japanese are a race of midgets. The Irish are boozers. The Mexicans are bandits.
And you Polacks are meatheads.
I mean, the upshot of that episode, which was, as you heard, extremely vulgar in terms of LGBTQ issues. But, the upshot of the episode was that Archie learns not only that Roger isn't gay, but that Archie's own best friend, his drinking buddy, a really bulking former all-star American football player, kind of the image of masculinity, his friend Steve, is in fact gay. And the episode really, really shocked audiences, but no one more than the president of the time, right, Richard Nixon. It really drew his homophobic ire, as is made evident by Watergate tape number 498-005. That's not the one that got him in the most trouble, but it's dated from May 13, 1971, on which President Nixon and his top aides, John Ehrlichman and Bob Haldeman, can be heard discussing this very episode of All in the Family, which the president happened to come across after watching a football game and flipping through the channels. And in a 15-minute rant, Nixon sums up the plot of the episode with his aides. He voices his moral outrage, and he starts to list the supposedly irrevocable dangers of such glorification of homosexuality, and explains how the fall of the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church, and the British Empire were all due to such casual acceptance of homosexuality, and how the United States could be next. Nixon was livid, especially because he had liked the second episode when Archie put on a suit because he wanted to write a letter to Nixon, and he wanted to show respect to the president, and he put on a suit just to write the letter. Nixon didn't realize that that was mockery.
Yeah, and we can imagine that Nixon probably never changed his mind over such topics, but you said earlier that the goal of the other characters in All in the Family was to educate Archie Bunker. Well, did he ever change his mind on homosexuality, for instance?
Well, I mean, he changed on some topics, maybe not on homosexuality as much as on some others, right? The Steve and Roger characters we mentioned from this 4th episode don't appear in any other episodes. It was really a one-off. But in the 8th season, in fact, once they had gone through so many other controversial issues, they did come back to LGBTQ issues, and there were 2 very important storylines in the 8th season, with really important episodes that were all nominated for Emmys. They were nominated for, all of the episodes of All in the Family nominated for Emmys in the 8th season were on LGBTQ issues. The second episode of the 8th season, called Cousin Liz's Funeral, basically Archie and Edith go to the funeral of Edith's cousin Liz, and at the funeral they discover that the deceased was a lesbian. And by the end of the episode, Archie finally recognizes Liz's female life partner as her widow after much insistence from Edith. So he does evolve on that. And in that same season, we have the Beverly Lasalle episodes, which are very famous today. Beverly Lasalle was a character played by a transvestite, a popular drag queen in the 1970s whose real name was Laurie Shannon, a transvestite that identified as male but dressed as a woman. Okay, and so this is a transvestite that kind of hilariously Archie first mistook for a woman when he was giving her CPR and the breath of life, or the kiss of life, right, in his cab. Archie was moonlighting as a cab driver in the evenings, right? He gave her CPR. But Beverly was much more than comic relief for the show. She was ultimately used to send a really strong message against gay bashing, because that's what happens. In the 11th episode, Beverly is beaten to death in the streets by gay bashers, right? Archie is hurt and sympathetic, but it's really Edith who is shaken to her very core, if you want. Edith loses her hitherto unshakable faith in God. She declares, Edith, that she could never again pray to a God that would allow something like this to happen, I quote, to someone so wonderful just because they was different. And once again, this shocking turn of events not only was on a sitcom, but on the Christmas episode, okay? About losing faith in God on Christmas, right? Wow. So it's really something. And both of those were nominated for Emmys, but it was the Cousin Liz episode that won the Emmy.
Okay, quite daring indeed. And how about the other aspects of his bigotry? Did he ever change, notably in terms of racism, for instance?
I mean, well, Archie and racism, well, that's a hard nut to crack, especially because with African Americans, I mean, racism was kind of Archie's signature form of bigotry. You know? However, there is a slight progression over the seasons, right? After spending all of the first season with Archie trying to prevent the black family, the Jeffersons, from moving into his neighborhood, 708 Hauser Street, to be exact. In season 2, there's an episode in which he is starstruck when he meets the black superstar, Sammy Davis Jr., in his cab. Again, he drives a cab at night to make extra money. Okay, and so when Sammy Davis Jr. has to come to Archie's house to pick up his briefcase, the briefcase that he left in Archie's taxi, Archie does everything to try to prove to Sammy Davis Jr. that he's not a racist. I mean, hilariously. I mean, here's a clip of how Sammy responds to him at one point, and how when Sammy Davis Jr. is leaving Archie's house, he really ambushes Archie by kissing him just as his parting photo is being taken by a neighbor, right? Archie does not suspect that a black man is going to kiss him at that very moment. And it elicited the longest studio audience laugh that was ever recorded at the time. It was actually noted that it was the longest. All of the actors had to wait around. They couldn't deliver the next line because this is delivered in front of a live audience, right? And it even kind of kisses away the unheard of use of the N-word in the episode, but not by Archie, by Sammy Davis Jr., okay, in talking about racism.
I think that, if God had meant us to be together, he'd have put us together. Well, look what he's done. He put you over in Africa, he put the rest of us in all the white countries.
Well, you must have told him where we were, because somebody came and got it.
Mr. Davis, this is an unexpected pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Can I get a picture,
No,
Mr.
no,
Davis?
come on, Munson, no pictures.
Oh, no, this one is for me. Mr. Munson, would you stand over there? I want one picture taken with Archie, my friend, and me.
You and me?
Yes. Now, on three, okay? 1, 2, 3.
And similarly, in the seventh season, there's another incident with race for Archie that helps him take some baby steps, if you want. Archie undergoes a blood transfusion at the hospital, but later he's in a panic when he learns that the blood that he got came from a black female donor. But that said, even Archie's racism may have its limits, because later in the season, that's going to be used in another context. When Archie suddenly finds himself inadvertently at a Ku Klux Klan meeting, really inadvertently. He doesn't realize these people are Klansmen, but the audience does. There's a little bit of dramatic irony there. We know what's going on. He doesn't realize what he's getting himself into. But when he realizes that it's the Klan, that the KKK, he wants nothing to do with them. And he uses the fact that he had that blood transfusion a year earlier to say that he is in fact black, right? That one drop of blood racist idea about being black, and that he and his brothers wouldn't let them burn any more crosses. And so he almost sounds like a black activist Archie at that point. Archie has a more striking change, I think, in the series, though, when it comes to his the way he talks about the Jewish people, about Jews, but whom he's constantly treating in the most vulgar anti-Semitical terms, like in this clip in which he talks about how you can tell by someone's name if they're really Jewish.
And second of all, how do you know the guy's not Russian or Jewish?
Oh, now, he ain't Jewish.
Well, how do you know?
Because his name's John. Heaps don't name their kids John.
Maybe he changed his name.
No, Edith, they never do. They only change the last name. That way they know each other. You see what I mean? Two guys are going down the street, right? One says, "How are you? My name is Smith." Morris Smith. See how it works? Like you got Saul Nelson, Izzy Watson,
Abe Lincoln.
So you heard there that Mike kind of got him at the end with Abraham Lincoln not fitting his rules about Jewish names. But it's really in season 3, episode 19, that it starts. There's a step in the right direction, but it's a pretty rough one. Archie is in fact mistaken for a Jewish neighbor. They think that his house is the Jewish house, and someone puts a huge swastika on his house, and he starts getting anonymous death threats over the phone. But he's helped by this really charismatic young man who's a member of the Hebrew Defense Association, who agrees to help Archie fight against this anti-Semitism. But that nice man who's helping him actually is killed in a car bombing in front of Archie's house, again on a sitcom, which seems rather, completely unexpected. And I think in terms of his relationship with Jewish people, it really comes to term in season 7, because in season 7, he goes to the funeral for his best friend, Stretch Cunningham, a character who we see from time to time, but we always hear about on the show, right? His friend Stretch Cunningham dies, and it's only when Archie goes to the funeral that he realizes that his best friend all of these years was Jewish. And Archie feels terrible guilt about how painful it must have been for his friend, Stretch, to listen to Archie say all of those anti-Semitic insults over all those years. So I think, sometimes he does change a little bit.
Yeah, he does. Apparently, from what you say, he does change somewhat, substantially over time.
I guess that one example, if you pick out those episodes, does make it seem like he changes a lot. But we should say that, Archie will always be Archie. That's what he was kind of created to be, right? And very often people would kind of excuse what he was doing. It's just Archie being Archie type of thing. But when Archie changes in the show, it is always because he knows people that he had always been insulting. He gets to know Jewish people. He gets to know black people, etc. It's never through Mike's arguments or finger wagging, that's for sure. And I should also say that the show itself kind of mellowed, not just Archie, but the show mellowed and became a little bit less controversial in terms of politics, at least, over time. Because, I mean, over the years, viewers started to feel like they were part of the Bunker family, right? And the storyline started to focus more on family matters, and they pulled at our heartstrings at time. And some of the topics were still controversial and completely new for television, talking about sexual assault, it happens to both Gloria and Edith. I mean, about breast cancer for Edith, about going through menopause. I mean, all of these things were never really discussed on TV before, but were not in the face-off between Mike and Archie all of the time like we were in the earlier seasons, right? So it was still controversial for a sitcom. We didn't have that confrontation every week. I mean, they were family. The show is called, right, All in the Family. And remember, I mean, they made Archie both bigoted and kind of lovable and endearing, kind of like a racist uncle you might have.
But isn't that also to some extent a little bit dangerous, creating a character that is both lovable and a bigot?
I mean, it is, I think, and apparently lots of people thought that as well. And that was indeed one of the attacks on the show that Norman Lear says really hurt the most. Perhaps because I think there might be some truth to it, right? It's the danger of having a lovable bigot on a show. I mean, there was the very famous event right after the first season. Author Laura Hobson very famously wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times in 1971 that was called "As I Listened to Archie Say Heeb," right? That slur that he uses for Jewish people, right? "As I Listened to Archie Say Heeb" is the name of the article, and in that op-ed piece, she claims that Norman Lear was dangerous for, I quote, "conning audiences into believing you can be bigoted and lovable." And it's not just a sentiment from 1971. In 2019, there was a CNN op-ed piece, because there was a type of reboot of the show. They were talking about it again, by R. Benjamin Rolsky. And he made the same claim, the same exact claim. And Lear, it's kind of funny, who is still around, right? And he's still working in television, had the same response for both of them, okay? And if I quote what he said in 1971, even though he had the same later on, he said in his article, his response to Laura Hobson, "What vacuum did you grow up in, right? Not a father, brother, uncle, aunt, friend, or neighbor who was both lovable and bigoted?" I mean, and of course he's got a point, right? He's got a point too. I mean, who doesn't have a family member who's not bigoted, at least in some way, right? And whom we kind of love in spite of all that, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, maybe it brings us to our final section today, the relevance of All in the Family and of the character of Archie Bunker today. We started out by saying that this was a show that was unknown in France, for instance, but so influential in the US. And we could go back to this, what you said about Archie just being Archie and his, what we could now call identification politics and grievance politics and the conservative views of racial protests. All these seem to ring so true today and to resonate with current issues, recent American politics. So how do we relate to All in the Family still today? Does it remain relevant? Has it become unacceptable? What would you say about that?
I mean, yes, it's true. I mean, there are so many things that, seem to be connected, to certain politics, if you want, today. But I mean, first of all, we have to think that, Archie Bunker is still relevant in the show because Archie Bunker, the character, is still a beloved icon, this archetype, right? And is really a household name, okay, that everyone knows at home. Yeah? If you have someone who's acting racist at Thanksgiving, you say, come on, don't be an Archie Bunker. That it's a very common way of referring to someone. And it's just as common in households as the nicknames that Archie used on the show to attack the other three members of his family. Dingbat, which he usually called Edith, Little Goyle, which he usually said to try to belittle his daughter, and Meathead or you dumb Polak, sorry, that's Archie, not me, okay, for Mike Stivic. But I think more importantly, Archie Bunker seems to be alive and well today in American politics, as you were saying, right? And a certain brand of conservatism, right? It's really amazing, I think, how many punchlines and moments of mockery of Archie from the 1970s can be taken out and played today and seem to, they were intended at the time to draw ridicule from the audience, but some of them seem to have reached mainstream. For example, there's a really famous episode in season 3, about gun control. Archie hears an editorial on television of someone who is in favor of gun control, who's against guns. And Archie is very upset, and he manages to get his right to a response. He manages to get airtime, and he is going to be on television. He's on television explaining why guns are good, right? If you want, why we need to have more guns. And, his proposal to stop skyjackings, right? Hijackings of planes with guns, in this clip we're going to hear, is met with laughter and guffaws and all of this, right, and mockery. Let's just listen to it.
Now I want to talk about another thing that's on everybody's mind today, and that's your stick-ups and your skyjackings, which, if that was up to me, I could end the skyjackings tomorrow.
You could?
All you got to do is arm all your passengers. And then he ain't got no more superiority there. He ain't going to dare to pull out no rod. And then your airlines, then they wouldn't have to search the passengers on the ground no more. They just pass out the pistols at the beginning of the trip, and they pick them up again at the end. Case closed.
That's incredible,
So we heard in that clip how everyone is making fun of Archie for this ridiculous idea of arming everyone. But this clip kind of, became topical again just a few years ago with all of the school shootings that were happening, the Portland shooting especially, but not only that, all over the United States. And this is only 2018, 2019. Because not only then President Donald Trump, but also Louisiana State Senator John Kennedy, and of course the head of the NRA, Dwayne LaPierre, all were pushing for a gun policy that was based on the idea that you had to arm everyone, arm all the teachers, for example, in schools, that the only thing that can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, so everyone should be armed. And no one was, weren't making fun of them. But what was crazy is that when they presented those ideas, suddenly that clip that we just heard from All in the Family was all over Twitter and social media, because we're not the only ones to make the connection. Apparently, a lot of people drew that connection, and even Texas Governor Greg Abbott in 2019 vetoed a bill about banning guns from airports and planes. Now, he wasn't against the idea of banning guns from planes, but airports, he thought everyone should have a right to carry a gun in Texas. So you can see that it's not that, what was a point of ridicule, right? The subject of ridicule in 1971 is part of policy in 2018, 2019. And there's another episode in which Archie goes on and on about what makes America great. And that then, together with his pining away for a sugar-coated vision of America before the civil rights period, things that we even heard in the theme song earlier, right? Are kind of part of the MAGA mindset, right? The Make America Great Again mindset. Maybe we can just hear that clip.
An American history lesson. You don't know nothing about Lady Liberty standing there in the harbor with her torch on high, screaming out to all the nations of the world, send me your poor, your deadbeats, you filthy. And all the nations sent them in here. They come swarming in like ants. Your Spanish PRs from the Caribbean there. Your Japs, your Chinamen, your Krauts and your Hebes, and your English fans. All of them come in here, and they're all free to live in their own separate sections. Where they feel safe, and they bust your head if you go in there. That's what makes America great, buddy.
You heard in that clip, of course, when he talks about what makes America great, he talks his own vision of Lady Liberty, of the Statue of Liberty, and everyone being separate but equal to live in their own sections, right, is quite disturbing. I mean, but Archie also at one point, for example, says in another episode, the future isn't what's wrong with the world today. There's too much future. There ain't enough past, which is, again, the idea of going back to this sugar-coated vision of America before there was any social, civil rights strife, if you want, back to before the 1960s. And it's kind of interesting that in 2017 at Cambridge University, there was actually a political science symposium I saw that was called Archie Bunker for President, a reference to what we spoke about earlier about the buttons and the fake presidential campaign in 1972. But this is 2017, and the topic was how Donald Trump and today's politicians seem to weaponize Archie Bunker's bigotry to try to appeal to the masses. And there are a lot of links to this.
So what do you think? How did this happen? When did the Archie Bunkers take over in the United States?
Well, in media, I think it has a lot to do with what we might call a lack of balance and the end of something I mentioned earlier, the end of that FCC doctrine called the Fairness Doctrine from the 1940s, because it was under Reagan, it was abolished, the Fairness Doctrine, in 1988, which immediately allowed certain media figures like Rush Limbaugh. I don't know if you know Rush Limbaugh, but he is a very famous far-right radio personality who died just a few weeks ago even. Basically, it allowed for this type of right-wing radio to be very, very, very biased, very, very far right. And this was just before certain news channels were created that also gave kind of one-sided far-right opinion, because the Fairness Doctrine no longer forced them to give both sides, right? Okay, and add to that factor, I think, the more recent multiplication of media channels and sources, all of the different channels and TV programs that we can watch, and the 100-fold multiplications of actual programs and series that are offered. And I mean, now no one has to watch news or entertainment that doesn't perfectly fit with their worldview, if you want, right? I mean, if Archie and Mike were around today, Archie would watch his TV channels and listen to his radio channels and be told that he is right about everything. And Meathead, Mike, would watch his channels and would be told that he's right, and never the twain shall meet. I mean, so in many ways, perhaps too many ways, I mean, kind of, it seems like Archie Bunker is here to stay.
Yeah, notably because we don't get this kind of show to watch together, in spite of our differences. So you would consider that there are no shows today that could be considered to be maybe the heirs of All in the Family or similar to All in the Family?
Yeah, I mean, we don't get that balance, but I mean, of course, there are plenty of, socially aware programs, some of them rather hard-hitting if you want, but socially aware programs today that deal with all of these issues that we've been talking about, but and quite a few of them stage one or more kind of ignorant characters among the main cast, right? I mean, Norman Lear himself has pointed to some recent shows that he really thinks are kind of the, offspring of his creation, All in the Family. And in his list, he mentions Blackish, Key and Peele, Modern Family, South Park, and especially Family Guy, the animated series, because the main character is very much kind of a modern-day Archie Bunker, okay, the main character there. They're all contemporary, they're all topical, they all mock bigots, but the big difference, I think, again, is that balance in the presentation, and perhaps more importantly, the balance in the audience that's watching, to have both sides watching the show, right? Most shows today just preach to the choir, basically, in the end, right? Because they have very few viewers who don't agree with their worldview tuning in. I mean, back in the 70s, everyone watched All in the Family, no matter how bigoted or how progressive they were, right? Bringing the often heated discussions, out of the TV and right into their living room And I think, surely changing a few minds, at least helping Americans talk it out.
All right, so definitely the All in the Family formula wouldn't work on today's TV as it has become.
Yeah, I think you're right. Apparently not. There's a professor from Boston University. His name is Hubie Jones, and he has done a recent study on All in the Family. And his conclusion was that All in the Family indeed wouldn't work today. For him, All in the Family was, in fact, in spite of the heated arguments and the racial slurs and all of this, and in spite of all that, it was too civil in that it was balanced, or that it was balanced treatment, in spite of the decibels and the slurs, and that it was especially too didactic. It's true, All in the Family is very obviously didactic. When you watch it, you see that everyone is trying to help Archie along, right? And they're trying to teach the audience that way. And, many people think that wouldn't work. Being so obviously didactic today wouldn't work either. Another, more proof perhaps that it wouldn't work today is the fact that they have tried to reboot the series in the past, 20 years or so, and it hasn't really worked. But, either it hasn't worked at all, like the 1994 series reboot 704 Hauser Street, 704 Hauser, which was canceled after only the first few episodes. The idea was they had this time an old black couple who used to be liberals in the 60s and 70s, right? An old black couple move into the same house that Archie Bunker used to live in the same set, but with their son, their son who was black but who was a neoconservative, kind of far-right African American, and whose girlfriend was Jewish and white, and so this was the setup that they tried to do. It didn't work at all. So either the reboots didn't work at all like that one, or they were simply designed as kind of one-off nostalgic evenings, in honor of All in the Family, which is what happened in 2019 with the live reboot of All in the Family, starring Woody Harrelson as Archie Bunker, Woody Harrelson as Archie. So it seems that, it was a show that was perfectly right for its time. It can't really work today, in spite of the way which it actually seemed to open the door to allow us today to talk about such controversial topics, and such more mature topics in general, right? So it opened that door, but we have kind of closed the door on that type of treatment, if you want, right? It seems like we should be sitting at the piano, pining away for a breakthrough show like All in the Family that educates everyone on today's controversial issues and allows us all to just talk it out, Those were the days.
So I won't start singing. Sorry. I know this was my cue, but I'll stop. At least we managed to talk it out with you, Dennis, today. Thank you so much for taking us down memory lane and visiting this groundbreaking show. I think it really showed how studying TV series also gives us a precious glimpse into American politics, into what constitutes us as a society, and how these shows reflect us, but also participate in shaping people as a society at some point, and as you said, talking it out when we disagree on basic issues. Thank you very much, Dennis. I hope it will help especially our French listeners to check out All in the Family. I know many episodes are available on YouTube.
Yes, most of them. Yeah.
And of course, we'll include many links to books and articles if you want to know more, and maybe links to some specific episodes. Thank you again.
It was a pleasure, really. Thank you.
And we'll be in touch soon for another episode of Histoire en série en VO.
Goodbye, thank you.
That's it for the second episode of Histoire en série en VO. Don't miss a single episode. Join us on Twitter @Histoire en série. and check out our guests' presentation and bibliography on our website, www.histoireensérie.com.
Such a beautiful blonde that populates your by your strangely animal.